All right, guys in the chat, if you are in there, can you let me know if you guys can hear me? Because I had some audio issues. Let me see. See if you guys in the chat, if you all right, so yeah, so we're all set. All right, so I want to respond to someone on YouTube. I normally don't name drop people. I'm not really a clout chaser, but Dante's Boxing Nation made a very, very, I thought, hypocritical statement in regards to Canelo Alvarez. And he's criticizing Canelo Alvarez, but he's not really criticizing the Charlo brothers in the same fashion. And if you want to, like I said before, a lot of these standards that are being applied to Canelo Alvarez, which I feel are double standards, they could be applied to other fighters. So he's criticizing Canelo Alvarez for never fighting the Charlo brothers. Okay, he's fighting, he's saying that they avoided the Charlo brothers because they're black fighters. Okay. And I'm not sure if he's saying that he's avoiding them because they're black or because they're slick. But if you think about it, are the Charlo brothers really slick fighters when you look at them? Okay. And ask yourselves, how many slick black fighters have the Charlo brothers fought? And when you look at Jamal Charlo's resume, let's take a look at him, because another claim that he made is Canelo never tried to unify titles, okay, against undefeated top-level black fighters. So let's ask ourselves, have the Charlo brothers done that? So when Jamal Charlo won his first world title, world title, let's take a look here. Back in 2016, he fought a guy named John Jackson, who was a black African-American fighter. He fought for a vacant world title, but John Jackson was not undefeated, and he was already previously knocked out before. Wasn't really a classic slick type boxer. He was more of a power puncher guy. Okay. Charles Hatley, again, he's not a slick guy. Definitely not a slick black African-American fighter. And he had a loss. Now, Erickson Lubin, you can make an argument that he may have had some slickness to him, but again, he got caught. It was a decent win. Give him full credit for that. But then when he fights Austin Trout, he was in a real tough fight. Okay? He was in a real tough fight. He won a majority decision. You can make an argument that he even lost that fight. Austin Trout was past his prime. Canelo Alvarez fought Austin Trout. And I thought that fight was very competitive. I scored that fight a draw. But regardless, Austin Trout, who was a slick black African-American fighter, Jamal Charlo had a lot of problems with him. Same thing with Tony Harrison in his next fight. Okay, he had a lot of problems with Tony Harrison. I actually had him losing that fight, 115 and 113. I know a lot of people disagree with me, but he definitely showed vulnerabilities against a slick, tall, lanky, black African-American slick fighter in Tony Harrison. So he lost to Tony Harrison. So then he fights Jorge Cotto, and then he has a rematch of Tony Harrison, who I believe was winning that fight before he got stopped. Full credit to Jamal Charlo for coming back and winning that fight by knockout. He showed a lot of grit, heart, and toughness and determination. So full credit for that win. But then in his very next fight against Jason Rosario, who's a PBC fighter, guy who I feel it was tailor-made for him. This was for a unification fight. This was for the WBA, IBF, and Jamal Charlo's WBC junior middleweight title. So Jamal Charlo won the title back in 2016. So it took him 4 years to actually unify the titles. And he did so against a guy who I would not think is a slick black African-American fighter. The only slick black African-American fighter that Jamal Charlo had fought at the time. No, actually, if you really look at it, he's never fought an undefeated slick black African-American fighter. Every time he's fought a slick black African-American fighter, they had a loss on their record. So I correct that statement. So the same statement that Dante's Boxing Nation made about Canelo could also be made about Jamal Charlo and also his brother Jamal Charlo. So it took him 4 years to unify these titles. And he fought a guy who I believe was a favorable style matchup. It was an in-house fight with Jason Rosario, who was a PBC fighter, a guy who I felt was tailor-made for him. Nobody gave Rosario a chance of beating Charlo, okay? So you can apply the same criticism to Jamal Charlo that you would apply to Canelo Alvarez, and even more so, I think, if you think about it, because we're going to dig deeper into this later on when we get to Canelo Alvarez's resume. But let's take a look at his brother, Jamal. Now, Jamal Charlo has never, ever in his career unified any titles, okay? He's never unified any titles, right? So let's take a brief look at his resume. And again, we're dealing with empirical data here. We're dealing with facts. Everything here is recorded. It's not really opinion-based. It's recorded stuff. Okay, so as I said, Jamal Charlo never ever unified a title. And when he first won his junior middleweight title back in 2015 against Cornelius Bundridge had already, he was like 40 years old. He was a black fighter, but he was not a slick black African-American fighter. Okay. And he knocked him out in 3 rounds. He's way past his prime, whatever. 40-year-old version of Cornelius Bundridge. Again, another favorable tailor-made fight for Jamal Charlo. Then he fights Willie Comfort, but then he goes on to fight a slick black African-American fighter. And he had a very tough fight. One judge scored at 115 and 113. Another judge scored at 116 and 112. Another judge scored at 116 and 112. If you look at the average fan scorecard, most people scored at a draw. I actually had Charlo winning that fight 115 and 113, but Austin Trout gave him all he could handle. And he also gave Jamal all he could handle because Jamal won a majority decision and Jamal won a close unanimous decision. You can even make an argument that maybe Trout could have eked out a draw here or maybe even edged out the fight. So Austin Trout, who was a slick black African-American fighter, gave both Charlo brothers problems. Okay. And make an argument that he may have eked out a decision against both Charlo brothers. All right. Williams, African-American fighter. I don't know if you want to call him slick, but he's definitely a very skilled guy. I wouldn't put him on Erislandy Lara's level or Austin Trout. Okay. So then after this Julian Williams fight, this is where it gets very interesting for Jamal Charlo. He fights Jorge Sebastian Holland, knocks him out in 4 rounds. Very favorable style matchup. Hugo Santonio Jr., another favorable style matchup. A guy, Matt Korobov, who most people thought that Charlo was going to destroy. Actually, a lot of people feel as though Korobov beat Jamal Charlo, and Korobov is not really a slick guy either. Okay? So Brandon Adams is another guy who had 2 losses. So again, where's the undefeated slick black African-American fighter that the Charlo brothers fought? You accuse Canelo of not fighting slick black African-American fighters, which is a lie because he fought Floyd Mayweather. When he fought Floyd Mayweather was undefeated. When he fought Erislandy Lara, Erislandy Lara had 1 loss, but technically I thought he won that fight. But Floyd Mayweather was undefeated. Austin Trout was a slick black African-American fighter. He was undefeated. But the Charlo brothers never, so Canelo, you can make an argument. You can't even make an argument. It's a fact that he did fight 2 slick black African-American fighters when they were undefeated. The Charlo brothers never have. So how are you going to accuse Canelo of doing something that is totally false according to the record. And you're not going to accuse the Charlo brothers, where we do have actual data proving that it can be applied to the Charlo brothers, and it's more applicable to their record and resume as opposed to Canelo's, right? So then he fights Dennis Hogan. Then he fights Sergey Deverenchenko, who I thought was a great win for him. I thought Sergey Deverenchenko beat Danny Jacobs. I thought he beat Canelo. I gave him the decision in both fights. So I thought that the Sergey Deverenchenko fight was a good win, solid win, but once again, not an undefeated, slick, black African-American fighter. There was another slick, black African-American fighter who the Charlo brothers never fought either, and that was Erislandy Lara. Then you can make an argument, well, he was in their camp, so he couldn't fight them. But so Deverenchenko was in Danny Jacobs' camp, and he did fight Danny Jacobs because the fight made sense. Okay, it was a fight that made sense, and it was a decent money fight for Jacobs and for Deverenchenko, so they fought. And Jacobs' trainer trained both guys, and he actually trained Jacobs instead of Deverenchenko. So again, Dante's Boxing Nation loves to call out fighters and fans and boxing writers for double standards, but he has to look in the mirror here, because he's actually applying double standards, because he's criticizing Canelo for doing something that these fighters that he's saying that Canelo avoided are doing. So let's take a look at Canelo, because everybody wants to shit on Canelo. I told you, once you're on the top, that's when the criticism comes. Everyone wants to knock you off that perch. There's a lot of fighters that are jealous of Canelo Alvarez because of his status, because of what he's able to do, because of the money he's making, this and that. They want to label him a prima donna. And again, you know, at points in his career, you could criticize him for the catch weights. That's a fair criticism. You know, when he did win his first world title at junior middleweight, and he fought Matthew Hatton, who was a 147-pounder, who wasn't a great fighter back in 2011, that was kind of a joke of a fight. We can't defend that. Then he goes on, after back in 2011, he won the vacant title against Matthew Hatton. Then he fights Ryan Rose in 2011, also fights Alfonso Gomez. Then he fights Kermit Cintron, and then Shane Mosley. So those, you know, and then Shane Mosley in 2012, Cito Lopez in 2012. Okay. So he won the title in 2011, but again, he took his first step-up fight in 2013, which was a unification fight. So in less than 2 years, he stepped up against a black, slick, undefeated African-American fighter, okay, in Austin Trout in 2013, only after having the title for less than a year and a half, okay? Where it took Charlo, Jamal, 4 years. And he didn't even fight a slick black African-American fighter. He fought a favorable house fighter, was basically tailor-made for him. So then, after the Austin Trout fight, which I scored that fight a draw, a lot of people had Canelo edging it. Let's look at the average fan scorecard. I love this feature on BoxRec. They have the average fan scorecard here. The average fan scorecard actually had Trout winning this fight 115 and 114. Okay? I had the fight a draw. I actually had Erislandy Lara beating Canelo as well. But again, the fights were close enough where you can make an argument that they were either draw or Canelo may have eked it out. So then, right after that fight, he fights the slickest black African-American fighter of our era in Floyd Mayweather Jr. And I don't like the criticism Floyd Mayweather Jr. gets for this fight. He fought a green Canelo Alvarez. Canelo Alvarez was 23 years old. He was a much bigger guy. Canelo Alvarez had he had like 45 fights. He had a tough, you know, he fought an opponent in Austin Trout who was a very tough guy. He won that fight, unified the titles. You know, Floyd Mayweather Jr. himself was 36 years old, much smaller guy. I don't think Floyd Mayweather Jr. gets enough credit for that fight. I thought that was probably arguably one of Floyd Mayweather's best performances outside of the Chico Corrales performance. That was probably either tied with that or maybe even slightly less impressive to me than that Chico Corrales fight. So then he goes and fights Alfredo Angulo. I apologize for that mistake. He fights Alfredo Angulo again because he had 2 tough fights back to back. One of them he lost. Needs a confidence builder. But later in that year, he jumps in with another slick black Cuban African fighter in Erislandy Lara, who was probably at the time the second slickest fighter in the division outside of Floyd Mayweather Jr. So you got Trout, Mayweather, and Erislandy Lara. Okay? All slick black African-American fighters. Trout and Mayweather were undefeated. Okay, so those claims you made were false because Canelo Alvarez has fought black, undefeated African-American fighters in their prime, and he's 1-1 against them. Okay? He's 1-1 against them. Jamal Charlo fought one. He eked out a close decision that could have gone either way. Jamal Charlo fought one, and he's 1-1 as well. So both Charlo brothers have shown some vulnerabilities themselves to slick black African-American fighters because they have had tough fights with Austin Trout, and Jamal Charlo had a tough fight with Tony Harrison, who I thought actually did win the first fight. I'm in the minority there. So after that Erislandy fight, he goes and fights James Kirkland. Okay, another easy fight. Again, you have to kind of balance things out in your career. You can't fight iron back to back to back to back. Got to mix it up a little bit. So then he fights Miguel Cotto, who Miguel Cotto was coming off a very good, impressive performance against Floyd Mayweather. He gave Floyd Mayweather all he could handle. I thought that fight would be competitive. I actually picked Miguel Cotto in that fight. I thought Canelo did win the fight, but I had it close. I had it very much closer than the judges had it. I thought that the fight was 115 and 113. So again, I'm not a Canelo homer. I'm not a Canelo fanboy. I'm just being objective here. I actually thought that he lost to Erislandy Lara. I thought the Trout fight was a draw. So I'm not giving him any favorable treatment here as far as my opinion. So we know the Amir Khan fight was a setup fight. We know the Liam Smith fight was a setup fight. But even though Amir Khan was a tough style matchup for Canelo Alvarez, I actually picked Amir Khan to win that fight, and I had him winning that fight until he got stopped by Alvarez. But the big knock on Alvarez is he has problems with guys who have quick feet, guys who can move and step around him. But he's gotten better at using feints, freezing guys, cutting off the ring. He's more patient setting up the shots. He goes to the body a lot more now than he ever has. He went to the body a lot in that Erislandy Lara fight, which is why a lot of judges and a lot of people gave him that fight because of his impressive body work. So we got to give him credit for that. So then after the Liam Smith fight, he fights Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., another pretty soft touch. But then after that, he goes right into a tough fight against Gennady Golovkin, who I thought was going to knock him out. A lot of people picked Gennady Golovkin to knock him out. I had the fight 115 to 113 for Golovkin. I thought it was a razor-close fight, but I have no problem with the draw because, again, if you throw a swing around here or there, the fight could be a draw. It's not impossible, but again, there is a history that in every close fight, we can't argue, Canelo does seem to get the decision. So there is a bias towards that. He is the house fighter. He does get the benefit of the doubt. Again, we're going to be objective here, but it doesn't mean that you couldn't make an argument for that fight being a draw. I had it 115 and 113. Second fight, I also had it 115 and 113 for Gennady Golovkin. But again, he fought the most dangerous perceived man in the middleweight division at the time. He was an underdog in both fights. He was not expected to win both fights. A lot of people thought that he lost the first fight, but they had it close. But the general consensus in the second fight was that he won the second fight. So if you look at the average fan scorecards in both fights, razor close fight. They had in the first fight, the average fan scorecard on Boschwick was 115 and 113 for Golovkin. So again, you throw a swing round in there. Again, it's not ridiculous or impossible to score that fight a draw. The second average fan scorecard had Gennady Golovkin 115 and 114. So again, these are razor close fights. Let's look at the average scorecard for the Austin Trout fight. They had it for Trout 115 and 114. Again, razor close fights. So, it's not ridiculous for Canelo to win these fights. What is ridiculous is the wide scorecards, and that does taint the victory somewhat. But again, I tend to ignore those ridiculous scorecards more often than not. There's a stupid scorecard in every fight, not just with Canelo, but with a lot of A-side fighters. So let's get the average scorecard for the Irslandi Lara fight. And they had Alvarez winning 115 and 114. So again, fans had all these fights that Canelo won. They had them very close, a point or 2 points. So for him to get the decision in those fights, it's not out of the realm of possibility. It's not ridiculous. So then he fights a soft touch in Rocky Fielding, setup fight. No one's crazy about that fight, but then he goes and fights Danny Jacobs, a guy who many people thought beat Gennady Golovkin. I had Danny Jacobs beating Gennady Golovkin. Let's take a look at the average fan scorecard for Danny Jacobs against Gennady Golovkin. Again, I like to do this because this kind of gives you an interpretation of the general consensus of how the public has these fights. I love that BoxRec does this. So the average scorecard was 114 and 113 for Golovkin. I had it the other way, 114 and 113. Again, these are close fights. So Danny Jacobs, I thought, and I think, and I still think, is a very solid, well-rounded fighter. He has a lot of ability. Sometimes second half of fights, he kind of goes in cruise control. So, it is what it is. Every fighter has their faults, and when Charlo fought Sergey Derevyanchenko, I had the fight 116 and 112. I thought Derevyanchenko came on in the second half of the fight. I actually had the last 6 rounds even, but I did have Charlo winning the first 5. So I had it 116 to 112 for Charlo, but I thought Derevyanchenko gave him all he could handle. All right, so I think if you want to be objective here, you want to be fair, then the same criticisms that you are going to put on Canelo Alvarez, I think they're more applicable to the Charlo brothers. And then people want to shit on the Sergey Kovalev fight. Again, that was a fight that Canelo was losing. Let's look at the average scorecard there. Most fans had Kovalev winning up until the time of the stoppage, 96-94, before the stoppage. You can make an argument Kovalev is a shot, whatever, but he beat a guy in Anthony Yard, gave Ward 2 tough fights. Kovalev is still legitimately, in my opinion, a top 4, top 5 light heavyweight in the world, even though he's an older guy. He's not what he once was, but he's still a legitimate top 5 light heavyweight. And for Canelo Alvarez to knock him out in the fashion that he did was very impressive. So I think that's an impressive win. And then everyone wants to shit on the Callum Smith fight, but no one was saying that Callum Smith was a joke before the fight took place. They're now saying he's a joke after the fight took place because everyone wants to be a Monday morning quarterback. Cannot defend the Yildirim fight, but this Billy Joe Saunders fight is a very intriguing fight. I still think Canelo will win this fight. But you can make an argument that Billy Joe Saunders is slicker than any fighter either Charlo brothers have fought in their career. I think you can make an argument there. Style-wise, this is a tough style matchup for Canelo Alvarez. Now, just because Billy Joe Saunders is not black, that doesn't mean he's not a slick, skilled fighter. He's shown great upper body movement up close, shown a great pair of legs, and he has a tendency to step up in the big fights. So he's going to be at his best, I think, on May 8th when they fight. So people are shitting on this fight, but I challenge them to pick someone on either Charlo brothers' resume that is a slicker, more skilled fighter than Billy Joe Saunders. I don't think you can do it. I don't think Austin Trout's slicker than Billy Joe Saunders because I think Austin Trout tends to stay in the pocket sometimes and exchange, and that's when he gets hit. Billy Joe Saunders is in and out very quickly. He has a very difficult style when he's on top of his game. Okay? He's on top of his game. So here's another thing. I mean, Jamal Charlo went on the Brian Custer podcast and said, you know what? I'm going to unify the titles at 160 before I move up to 168. So if he's going to be fighting twice a year, which is generally what he's been doing, then he wouldn't be available to fight. He wouldn't be available to fight Canelo until 2023 at the very earliest, maybe even later. So again, with his Dante's Boxing Nation even made a video about Jamal Charlo's statement saying that he was befuddled by them. So how could Jamal Charlo be avoided by Canelo Alvarez when Canelo Alvarez fights at 168 and has been fighting at 168 since 2018 for the last 3 years? Billy Joe Saunders has been fighting at 168 since 2018 in the last three years, and Canelo even fought as high as 175. So when you look at a guy like Jamal Charlo, you look at a guy like Demetrius Andrade, these guys have never fought at 168 ever in their career. So if these guys want to fight Canelo Alvarez, then they would do what Billy Joe Saunders did. They would move up and follow him to 168. I think Billy Joe Saunders can still make 160. I question whether Canelo can because he's a very thick, muscular guy. So that's the thing, guys. There's a lot of hypocrisy, double standards, and everyone wants to make these statements, but no one's actually doing the research and really looking at all the fighters. You're accusing one fighter of doing something that other fighters are doing even worse. And I showed you Floyd Mayweather, Erislandy Lara, Austin Trout, all slick fighters, right? Billy Joe Saunders, very slick fighter. That's four slick fighters. Jamal Charlo, one slick fighter that Jamal fought. The only slick fighter on Jamal Charlo's resume, in my opinion, is Austin Trout. The only two slick fighters on Jamal Charlo's record, in my opinion, is Austin Trout and Tony Harrison. And Tony Harrison, you know, he has a tendency to have lapses as well. He was knocked out by Willie Nelson. So he's slick, but he's, you know, so a lot of times he has lapses and he kind of lets his guard down a little bit. So he's vulnerable in the fact that sometimes he'll stay and he'll try to trade as well. And he'll allow himself to get caught on the ropes. Billy Joe Saunders never, I challenge anyone to watch a Billy Joe Saunders fight and see him pinned up against the ropes by anyone. Go back and look at that fight that he had with Chris Eubank. Go back and look at that fight that he had with David Lemieux. His back was never on the ropes in those fights. You know, so again, Dante's Boxing Nation made a video, and it was a very hypocritical video. It was very double standard type video. Okay, so once again, Crawford has never really fought any black African-American slick fighters. Both Charlo brothers have not fought a lot of black African-American slick fighters. Okay, so why is Canelo, who fought more black African slick American fighters than these guys did, why is Dante's Boxing Nation criticizing him and not applying the same standards to the Charlo brothers, to Andrade? Okay, why is he not applying the same standards? Why is he not applying the same standards? And then you got a guy, Jamal Charlo, who said, I'm not moving up to 168 until I unify at 160. So he's basically telling you that there's no way he can fight Canelo in the next 2 years. There's no way. And then, you know, and then you want to make a statement about Canelo Alvarez, which is totally false, because Austin Trout and Floyd Mayweather were both slick black undefeated fighters when they fought Canelo Alvarez. And you said that he never fought a slick black African-American fighter when they were undefeated. And you're wrong. And you're wrong. Both Charlo brothers never fought a slick black undefeated African-American fighter, because Tony Harrison had a loss, and so did Austin Trout. He had a couple losses before he fought both Charlo brothers. So again, your statements are incorrect. You can't make you have a right to your own opinion, but you don't have a right to your own facts. The facts are incorrect. Your information is wrong, and I've proved it wrong. And any objective person, whether you hate Canelo, love Canelo, whatever, okay? So, and now we're going to do the whataboutisms in the chat. I mean, people are acting brand new. Again, you have to watch my videos. You can't accuse me of stuff that I've never done, because, again, I apply the same standards to all fighters. Okay, don't sit there and tell me that I never criticized Lomachenko. I think he was I think he was an overrated fighter. That doesn't, again, when you say someone's overrated, that doesn't mean you think they're a bad fighter. That doesn't even mean you don't think they're a great fighter. But when you stop saying and mentioning Lomachenko's name in the same breath as Roberto Duran, then you're overrating him. Again, you can't make statements if you don't have the information. You're making false statements, okay? I was one of the few people that picked Teofimo Lopez to beat Lomachenko, okay? So don't make these statements. You got to do the homework. You embarrass yourself because I can pull up audio and video to support my arguments. Again, you guys, the internet is forever. BoxRec is the internet, okay? When a fighter fights a professional fight or an amateur fight, okay, that data and information is forever, okay? Show me the slick black African-American fighters that Terrence Crawford is fighting. Show me the slick black African-American fighter that Errol Spence is fighting. Show me the slick black African-American fighter that the Charlo brothers are fighting. Explain it to me. Prove me wrong, and I'll tell you I'm wrong. Okay? I'll tell you I'm wrong. But you can't. So I would put Canelo's resume up against any active fighter today, and I think he has the best resume. Canelo Alvarez, if you think about it, Floyd Mayweather is a Hall of Fame fighter. Miguel Cotto will go in the Hall of Fame. Okay? Gennady Golovkin will go in the Hall of Fame. Those are Hall of Fame fighters. Sergey Kovalev, that's questionable. You can make an argument, but I'm not quite sure. So, you know, you could look. Shane Mosley will go, you know, is a Hall of Fame fighter as well, even though he's past his prime. Show me a fighter on either Charlo brothers' resume that's a Hall of Fame fighter. They've never had a big fight. Never. Canelo had big fights with Cotto, Mayweather. Okay? He had big fights with Golovkin, Kovalev. You gotta look at the history. You gotta look at the empirical data. A lot of you guys have what I love to call, and I like to bring this up, you have cognitive dissonance. You have confirmation bias. You only pick out things that you want to pick out, but you're not looking at the big picture. I'm going to call out Dante's Boxing Nation because, again, his information is incorrect. It's wrong. It's wrong. You're applying your double standards, and you sound very biased. Sound very biased. So I don't agree with you. I don't even think you believe what you're saying. I think you're just doing it for hits, to be perfectly honest with you. You have an audience, and you want to, you know, it's amazing to me when you know, everything's got to be about race. And again, it's not my place to talk about race. I tend to avoid doing it. But you know, you're trying to use race as in a situation where it doesn't need to be applied. You're not going to sit there and tell me either Charlo brother is a slicker fighter than Billy Joe Saunders. Billy Joe Saunders is white, but he's still slicker than either Charlo brother. He has a more elusive style than either Charlo brother. So again, we want to make these bigoted statements, say all Mexican fighters are brawlers, all black fighters are slick, and it's just not the case. You can't just look at, say, an ethnic group all fight a specific way. It's a very bigoted statement. It really is. It really is. And I just find it bizarre that that he would shit on Canelo Alvarez like that. You know? Everyone wants to act like Canelo Alvarez was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. But you know, he turned pro in 2005. Had a lot of fights in Mexico, very low profile fights. Took him a while to start making money. He turned pro in 2005, you know, and for the longest time he was fighting, you know, low profile fights. He's fighting in Mexico. People really didn't see him. He didn't start getting popular until like 2013. So for the first 8 years of his career, like no one even knew who he was. Really, if you think about it, he didn't start getting popular until like I'm gonna say 2011. So for the first 6 years of his career, you know, people really he didn't really catch fire yet. So once again, you know, if anyone wants to call me out on these statements, prove me wrong. Show me the data. So Canelo Alvarez won his title in 2011, and he did unify his title against a black, slick African American fighter in 2013. So you're wrong. He did unify. Your statement about him never unifying a title against a slick, undefeated black African American fighter is incorrect, because he did that against Austin Trout. The Charlo brothers never did, because again, they never fought an undefeated fighter to win any of their titles. No fighter was undefeated at the time they fought the Charlo brothers when they won their titles. They never fought an undefeated fighter in winning a title fight. They never did. When Jamal Charlo won his title, his first title, he fought it against Cornelius Bundridge, who had 4 or 5 losses at the time. When he fought Jason Rosario had a knockout loss to Gallimore. Okay? So you have to apply the statements that you made to the Charlo brothers, because that's a factual statement. You're wrong. So I don't want to keep repeating myself, beating a dead horse. All you got to do is go on BoxRec. Like I said, the internet is forever. What you say, you have to be held accountable for. You just can't make statements that are false and expect people to not call you out on it. So at the end of the day, Dante's Boxing Nation is basically talking more so about emotion. He's making it a race thing like he always does, because that's his shtick. That's his shtick. You know, I don't even think he believes half the stuff he says. I don't think the LDBC guys believe half the stuff they say. I think they all say this stuff because they know it stirs up a lot of controversy, gets them clicks. They do it for money. They do it for money. They do it for money. You know, that's just my opinion. I think they're using race as a way of trying to stir controversy, because anytime you bring race into something, it's a hot button issue, and it's just not applicable here. It's just not applicable here. It's a bigoted statement to claim that all African American fighters are slick. James Kirkland is not slick. Sean Porter is not slick. Okay, Deontay Wilder is not slick. Okay, Deontay Wilder is not slick. Willie Harrison is not slick. Okay, there's a lot of black fighters that are not slick fighters. Okay, to just sit there and say that all black fighters are slick. Again, I challenge any of you. Show me one guy on either Charlo's resume that is a slicker fighter than Irislandi Lara or Billy Joe Saunders. You can't do it. You can't do it. You can't do it. He fought 2 black fighters, 2 black slick fighters back to back. Canelo Alvarez did. And that was only a year and a half after winning his title. So you can criticize him for the catch weight stuff. Okay? You could criticize him for maybe waiting until Golovkin got a little bit older before he fought him. But again, you can't Monday morning quarterback it, because most of us even still picked Golovkin regardless of the age. Okay? You can make these statements all you want, but you have to provide data to support your statements. And you can't do that. You can't do that. So you're wrong. He did fight. He did win a title against an undefeated, slick black African American fighter. Did. He beat Austin Trout. Okay. Beat Danny Jacobs, who's a good counter puncher. Has a little bit of slickness to him. All right, guys. Till next time, Beavis out. Make sure you check us out every Sunday, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, Ringside Reporter Podcast. Until next time, Beavis out. Make sure you stay safe and have a great day, man. I appreciate all the support.